I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source on the democracy question and the embattled fate of our own, beset as it is from within. Philosopher-historian Danielle Allen is our guest examiner of the cranky American condition. Feels to me shaken, defensive, divided, embarrassed, as I don't remember ever before, around questions that go to our character as a country, too. Questions about democracies morphing, sometimes disappearing, even dying. In all the talk I'm hearing, Danielle Allen, what's different about you is your timeline. Your eye goes back to ancient days in Athens and Rome, especially to your friend Aristotle, who wrote the book on democracy and its corruptions in oligarchy and other ways. Just for starters, set our troubles in 2025 alongside the wisdom of Aristotle and that spectrum of, say, 3,500 years from ancient Athens at its best. The long view, where are we?
Well, thank you, Chris. Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure.
The long view takes us back to the first distinction of politics, which is just the question of, is rule being conducted in the interests of the ruler or the interests of the ruled? That's the first distinction between good politics and bad politics. It's Plato and Aristotle both. And it didn't matter really from Aristotle's point of view whether you had rule of the one, rule of the few, or rule of the many, so monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy, as long as, whichever form you had, it was conducted in the interests of the people. So that really is the first test when one watches a government. Are the actions in the interests of the people, or are they in the interests of the ruler? And I think we have a moment in time where we're seeing a heck of a lot of self-interest and self-dealing on the part of our political leaders, including the president.
Aristotle understood something about the dangers to the people's interest, the people's rule, and he called it oligarchy.
Yeah, one can't really call Aristotle a pro-democracy person. It's not as straightforward as that. He was in favor of good rule, and literally, for him, there were different possible kinds of good rule. You could have good rule by one person, you could have good rule by a few people, you could have good rule by many people. For him, the kind of rule he was most interested in was actually what he called constitutionalism. So it was rule by the many, though Aristotle had enough exclusions from his citizenry that that's the sense in which you can't really call him a proper democrat. But he had imagined a world where you had a collective of virtuous citizens who would rule and be ruled in turn. So everybody would have a chance at rule, and everybody would also understand that they also had to submit to rule. And what distinguished that form of rule was commitment to the rule of law, commitment to institutional structures, all of which were designed to cultivate and secure the common good.
Be specific, if you can, about what he had observed in the picture you draw of an unhappy people today. Where would he say, I told you so, or we could have foreseen that?
So what is Aristotle good for? Aristotle is good for understanding the relationship between culture or character and law, for example. So for Aristotle, every society was aspiring to cultivate virtue in human beings. It's a much grander ambition than the ambition most of us carry around these days when we think about politics, right? We just want to be free. I'm not so worried about somebody trying to make us virtuous. We want to be free.
And you keep trying to bring it back to human flourishing. We'll get to that.
Exactly. Yeah. So what Aristotle does also have, which I find incredibly valuable, is a picture of human beings, what we are as a species, as a category. And we're social, for example. We're not only competitive, we're also cooperative. And we're altruistic. That's actually as much in our nature as our antagonistic elements. We have a natural capacity for friendship. And that natural capacity for friendship is actually what should give us our deepest lessons about what is possible in politics. So we can aspire in a society to even sort of spread at great distance and with strangers to have something that he calls sort of an experience like friendship. It might not have the emotional heft of friendship, but it should have the same basic practices. And so for him, that's what a culture of a healthy constitutional society consists of, is practices where people expect to have to prove themselves trustworthy to each other, where they do treat each other as equals, that there's a respect for each other's agency. You have a sort of sense of, my sphere of agency shouldn't trample on your sphere of agency. These are the features of healthy civic practice for Aristotle.
Come back to the unhappy society you picture today. What are you observing with your own eyes? An American woman, you've taught a lot of places, and now university professor, and here we are at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard. What are you noticing?
I am seeing a country that doesn't know if it wants to be free or not.
Spell it out.
Well, we are watching unilateral executive rule. The legislature is essentially non-functioning. That's a collapse of the basic constitutional structure that was created precisely in order to avoid unilateral executive rule. So the situation, 1760s, 1770s, was that Parliament had ceased to have any meaningful independence from the king. And so although the British had an understanding of their constitutional liberties and the way in which there were supposed to be limits on executive authority, the British themselves, London, 1760s and 1770s, were lots of protests and uprisings because they thought that the king had ceased to respect those limits, and they also thought that Parliament wasn't standing up to the king. And those folks in London who thought that weren't alone. Obviously, people in the American colonies thought so too. And as they experienced suppression of dissent, threatening of newspaper publishers, putting them on trial, throwing them in prison, as they experienced tariffs that massively upended their economy, they grew ever more frustrated with unitary executive power, unilateral executive power. And for that reason, we had the revolution and then the development of the Constitution, the entire purpose of which was to put limits on that executive. But that whole story was possible only because people wanted to be free. They didn't want to be subjected to the arbitrary whims of some random single individual. They wanted to see popular will channeled through the legislative body and to have that popular will actually set the direction for their society. So as we watch conditions emerge that existed 260 years ago, it is unclear to me that as a people, we have the same desire to be free as Americans and Londoners had in the 1760s.
Interesting point. Personal note here. The funny link between you and me is that we both ran for an office that we never thought we would win. You for governor of Massachusetts 2 years ago.
Well, I might have had one little minute where I thought maybe I was going to win.
Well, me for mayor of Boston 20 years ago. Both of us, I reflect now, out of a certain sneaky impulse to try the fun of active citizenship in a democratic republic. It's doctrine for you that we should all take the right to run for office as seriously as the right to vote.
That's right.
The creative joy of participation you read about. Even then, I think we were both trying to enact Republican virtue, as it was called, Sam Adams being the ultimate model, I think, the hero of the War of Independence, two-fisted guy, aristocrat, networked with farmers and workers. He had a Harvard education, no interest in money, no profession, no real career. And he would have called himself a Republican who takes government seriously and the personal virtues that sustain it. Was that a little bit in your head as you aimed at the governor's office?
Yes, it was. I have a deep belief in the value to human well-being of helping to steer your community. And one of the most important ways of doing that is to run for office. Running for office is as important as holding office. Somebody's got to lose, right? Like I always like to make this point that you can't have democracy, you can't have elections unless you have some people who are willing to be good losers. So it is a huge public service. And Yes. I was concerned. It was a time in the pandemic when I didn't agree with the direction of response. I thought we could have done a lot more, for example, to avoid the travesty of the huge disparity between mortality rates, say, here in the Harvard community and mortality rates in Chelsea, right? Just a couple miles apart. We had the capacity in this state not to have let that happen. And so I was very frustrated about that. And so I did feel like I was stepping into a vacuum. There weren't a lot of voices raising questions or trying to propose alternatives. Happily, in the end, we got more voices, and that itself felt like a victory. But yes, the right to run is in the Massachusetts Constitution, comes right after the right to vote. And both things are necessary for free self-government among free and equal citizens.
Come back to where we are and just flagging of any visible zeal for freedom. Most people would be shocked to hear that said about themselves, but I sense where you're coming from. Spell it out.
Obviously, there are a significant number of activists on both sides of the political spectrum who are very attuned to their freedom. But I think they're not the majority of the population. It's kind of astonishing at some level how we can be watching all of the structures of constitutionalism kind of be imploding, yet for most people, I think, life kind of is just going on as normal. The peripheral of their understanding, they recognize that, some people are getting persecuted, right? Harvard's getting persecuted. You have people who are snatched off the streets. That's a form of persecution.
Yeah.
And that sort of backs of people's minds. But people stand around waiting for the bus to go home after work, and they, go pick up the kids from school, and the kids still have soccer games on Saturdays, and all of the ordinary toings and froings of life, for the most part, continue. And so I think that means we are more attached, and understandably so, to stability and security than actually we are to freedom. And again, not because anybody's doing anything terrible, but because we've been fortunate. We've been able to be complacent about what is required to protect freedom.
I might have agreed until, say, a month ago, but surely since the Musk-Trump thing blew up, everybody's noticing something very, very strange, not to mention Los Angeles and where in the world that's going to go. You hear it in so many things. Serge Schmemann of the New York Times wrote an interesting piece the other day, forever the Moscow bureau guy for the New York Times. This week he wrote a personal piece wondering how different this was from the 60s, or in what ways this was different from the 60s. And he said, for me, there were Cold War issues, all kinds of personal issues that were different, but he said the big difference for him is the spirit of the times, the sense back then that change was possible, and today that doors are being closed. And he made a sort of exception for the student protests in the spring last year against the carnage by Israel in Gaza. That, he said, never ignited a broader movement and petered out, mired in accusations of anti-Semitism and the humiliation of university leaders. The momentum was with President Trump and his MAGA campaign, and its goal was, in effect, to reverse the gains of the 60s, to undo civil rights, sexual tolerance, environmental protection, campus activism, all those other themes and values clustered around the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, getting to be mid-June 2025, we see it playing out in Los Angeles, and on June 14th, in a military parade down Constitution Avenue in Washington. How do you sort of put together the feelings that this arouses? I think in all of us.
That's a good question. I mean, I see what you see in the sense of people naming a different moment, people calling an alert, people saying, pay attention, this is different. At the same time, I also see, and to some extent I'm just communicating something about observing about my own life, right, that people also take it in stride and people start going about their lives, and there's another little thing in the sort of mental furniture, but people carry on with their lives. Masha Gessen actually had some really good comments about this in one of their recent columns, where they said one of the hardest things about dealing with the turn to authoritarianism or autocracy is that humans are incredibly resilient. And I think this was in a conversation with David Brooks or different member of their editorial board who made the comment that it's like the sort of research apparently about people who suffer an amputation or a very serious physical blow of some kind. There's a kind of hit, but then they recover, not necessarily physically, but they actually report some period post the injury the same level of happiness as they reported prior to that injury. And I think about Turkey, and I think about Hungary, and I think about China. And there are masses and masses of people in those countries just going about their lives, right? Going to school, going to work.
I wonder.
It is a wondering, as I'm trying to understand our moment. My wondering is, my sense, what I think I see, is two things. I think I see that authoritarian regimes are better than at other points in the past at a certain kind of basic economic management, so that the economies of their societies can be reasonably sound and stable, and that they're also better at targeted suppression, so that journalists get suppressed or universities get suppressed, but the bulk of the people are left alone.
Yes and no. I always read Marcia Gesson with great respect, but in this case, I was struck by Marilyn Robinson's observation that we're living under occupation, culturally and politically. These things can all be true. It got me wondering if this is what Mao's Cultural Revolution would have felt like in China in the 1960s into the 70s, the cult of the leader, inescapable, and his little red book, in effect, a war on the people, which became a decade of chaos in China, untold damage. But I have the feeling that something like that has settled in, and it's very, very hard to talk back to it.
I'm going to challenge you on that one.
Please.
Because I think that one is not as straightforward as that. And the reason is because that feels like that to you here in blue Massachusetts, but the last 4 years have felt that way to people in red states. For example, Joe Biden, one of the first things he did, his first executive order was his whole of government equity executive order. And it rapidly transformed the policy landscape everywhere. For example, like all the federal grants that have just got canceled because they had the word equity in them, they all had the word equity in them because of that Joe Biden executive order. In other words, we have had cultural revolution on both sides. So yes, this is cultural revolution, but only in a context where half of the country has experienced a different cultural revolution for the last couple of decades. That's why we have a culture war going on. So yes, there's a culture war for sure. And that's what a culture war feels like. But I think it's important to recognize that that what you just described, that sort of picture of cultural revolution, is exactly how people on the right feel about the cultural developments of the last 20 years.
Why didn't we hear about it directly from people who were being put out of jobs, if they were, by DEI?
Partly it's what we now call DEI, although I take that to be basically a kind of political characterization, so I'm not always sure it's a helpful label. But it's also about gender relations. It's about sexuality. It's about a whole panoply of things. And it was being expressed. If those of us in blue states or blue contexts didn't hear it, that I think is a reflection of the fragmentation of our media environment. So I'll just be really explicit and give you a concrete example. During the fall 2023 events, when President Gay was being so violently attacked, I was really struck because I read the conservative press as well as reading the mainstream press. I read the Washington Examiner, I read the Free Beacon, I read the New York Sun, I read a lot of stuff. And it was shocking because themes, ideas, claims, and so forth that were circulating there were circulating and totally visible, clearly apparent where things were heading next 2 weeks before anybody in the mainstream press or in my context here at Harvard was registering that X theme was about to emerge. In other words, folks who are attuned to the mainstream media tend not to be reading and listening to the places where the other points of view are being expressed they have been being expressed for quite some time.
When you read it in the conservative press, what did you think you had to do about it?
So the point is just over time, I suppose, for me, it has produced a lot of different things that I do about this. So I do spend more time probably than others, like literally trying to build cross-ideological coalitions so that people hear each other, just at the most basic first level. And then, if you're asking a question about the events of 2023, I started saying to people, hey, here's what I'm seeing. I think maybe you should pay attention to it.
I mean, the sexual issues, for sure, the identity issues, they affect and touch everybody in a way. What were the other ones that you thought were building blocks? Race, yes or no?
Sure. I mean, at this point, there's a lot, right? There's just a completely sort of alternative worldview. Yes, I mean, there's a fair amount that's about race in this conversation about what's happening to American civilization and so forth. Some of it, as we can now all see, is a sort of economic conversation. A heck of a lot of it is about science and a very different perspective on whether or not high-end science is delivering good things for human beings or taking advantage of us, where we're kind of object of extraction for pharmaceutical companies. And there are places where some of the stuff that's coming out of the right converges with things coming out of the left, right? Like that last point about pharmaceutical companies, for example, one could imagine hearing that kind of worry and critique about a kind of science pharmaceutical industrial complex from the left as well as from the right. There's a different picture, a different diagnosis of the world that we're in that is available, but our media landscape is so fragmented that it's very hard for any person to actually see the whole story, the many different storylines that Americans are telling themselves.
Yeah.
I think if one's trying to understand the politics around this, COVID really is the right case to look at, where COVID and the way in which expertise functioned in the context of COVID really did generate a kind of legitimacy crisis for science for a lot of Americans. So we might talk about Harvard students. And
please.
I was having lunch with one student recently who is more conservative student, and who said that as he saw it, COVID had so decimated the lives of high school kids his age that, especially in his experience, young men were so angry about what had been taken from them with the forced requirements that they stay indoors and apart from each other and so forth, that it has deeply eroded their trust in institutional authority. And it makes sense, right? Because they were young. They could have gotten COVID and been fine. So they didn't get to go to school. They didn't get to go to prom. They didn't get to play their championship sports games their senior year in high school that they'd been training for 3 years. It was their once-in-a-life chance to go to the state championships. Didn't get to go. They're angry about that. And the target of their anger is technocratic expertise.
Speak more about the conservative undertone you pick up from Harvard undergraduates.
Yeah, I mean, there are conservatives on campus, all kinds of issues that conservatives care about, right? So immigration, obviously the economy, all the recognizable features of the agenda of the current administration are on the minds of conservative students, as is the subject of religion and certainly the subjects of gender and sexuality.
How does that work? Again, it's a deep puzzle to me how Donald Trump benefits from a certain spiritual hunger alive in the land when he's openly, happily a reprobate on almost all the things that traditional religions care about or preach.
It's crazy, but I think he's just comfortable around religious people. I think it's as simple as that, and they recognize it. Whereas secular contexts, people aren't comfortable around religious people, and people recognize that. People can feel it. It's as simple as that. He's not shameable, so that makes it easy for him to be comfortable around religious people, despite his own characteristics, right? Like his own shamelessness makes it possible for him to be completely at home in religious settings. But I think for that reason, it is just also a kind of fact of our world that there are lots of places where the way in which secularism operates has a result of meaning that people are kind of trained into being uncomfortable if faith emerges and shows itself, has a kind of embodied presence. And It's just at the kind of, I think, visceral animal spirits level, people know when people are or aren't comfortable around them.
This is interesting, Danielle Allen. I think I've trusted in a rather naive way in a self-correcting mechanism. When a lot of people are anxious, it'll eventually, if not in a matter of days, make the network news or the New York Times page one. Why doesn't it? And why have we found so many other ways to kid ourselves about Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, so this is where, I do think we have permitted an ideological segregation of our society to emerge. I mean, we know this at some level. There is Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, which is about how, as people have moved over the last few decades, you've ended up with zip codes that are coded ideologically red or blue. So there just has been, measurable sorting of Americans into kind of ideological enclaves. And then there's been institutional reinforcement of that. So I am a person, I've actually advocated for quite some time that universities needed to work on viewpoint diversity. So that for me is not a new theme. It's a place where I actually do agree with conservatives. I think we do have a problem at universities.
Yeah, speak about it.
But once you have that kind of segregation and you don't have social connection across viewpoint lines, that's what then results. You get siloed narratives, siloed storytelling. Questions that are in one place don't show up in the other place, and then people stop being aware that those questions exist, and vice versa on both sides. So I see the issues as fundamentally, in that regard, social, cultural, lack of connection among us. And again, none of that is to excuse President Trump. There's a whole lot of other stuff to talk about that's just particular to him. But what are the conditions that have made it possible for him to have the following that he has? I think these are some of the conditions that make that possible.
I wonder how you, for example, starting today, would bring viewpoint diversity to a great non-denominational, no longer a church school like Harvard.
Well, maybe I'll just tell you the things I do.
Sure.
And then, from my point of view, all of that could be scaled up. Other people could be doing it, could be institutionally supported more consistently. So when I ran the Stafford Center for Ethics, we started something shortly before the pandemic called the Civil Disagreement Series. And its structure was we had conversations, moderated conversations, not debates, but moderated conversations, only on controversial topics. So guns, abortion, reproduction, immigration, et cetera. Literally, if it wasn't controversial, we didn't do it. And we always had 4 speakers representing 4 different kind of corners of opinion. And we supported that with a fellowship program for students who were recruited into the program because they had a range of viewpoints, and they would go through a sort of training learning how to moderate conversations. And then after the public event, they would host moderated conversations for their peers. And also, we built this as a collaboration with about 4 other campuses around the country so that we could get different perspectives in.
What were the 4?
So Stanford, and then a community college in New Mexico. And the 4th one was another kind of geographical place, quite different. I'm not going to remember now. And anyway, it's still running, and there may be some more schools in it now. But the point is that every school was pulling together a cohort where the goal was to have diversity within that cohort. But then the schools were in such different places that we were getting more diversity. And so the students had the chance in that way to encounter a sort of bigger range of perspective. But again, we were also modeling what it meant for pro-life and pro-abortion people to be in the same conversation, exploring and explaining why they held their views and looking for, what were the places where they actually had some agreement, for example, on the well-being of the mother and the well-being of children and things like that. Actually agreement, and then, sort of differences about why one chooses one approach or another to the specific policy of abortion. But that's one example. Another example is if I am programming a conference or panel, I am always asking the question, who disagrees the most with the rest of the speakers here? And then let's figure out in that set of people who disagree the most, who are the best? Who are the ones who actually advocate on the basis of sound standards of evidence and reasoning and so forth. And then those are the people we'll invite. So always trying to figure out how to bring in the people who disagree the most and exhibit excellence in academic standards into the conversation. So anyway, we could just be doing that consistently across the board, and that would completely change the environment.
And the result is what?
That you get more conservatives, because typically that line of who disagrees the most with something also falls along an ideological spectrum. So same thing. Ditto, if I'm thinking about faculty hiring, I'm asking the question, how can we have something that opens up the intellectual space on offer here? So that's a wider intellectual space that's on offer. I'll just give you one more example of something that I did. I was one of the co-chairs for the American Political Science Association annual program last year, and we wanted to and did sponsor a panel about Israel and Gaza, because basically too many people in too many contexts were of the view that it couldn't be done. It wasn't possible to actually have a conversation with a range of perspectives and have something productive happen. So we did. It was great. They really did have a huge range of opinion and very different sort of situations and perspectives. We had a very productive conversation. And so I guess my point is just that these things are doable. We don't do them often enough because of fear or because of lack of experience, lack of confidence, and so forth. The example I just gave is a university example. But I do think that universities have a special responsibility to do the work of building spaces where these hard conversations can happen, because it is basically our job. Like, it isn't anybody else's job.
Yeah.
Like, the rest of it is entertainment, okay? I mean, always has been. Rome, bread and circuses, it always has been, all right? But universities, we above all, are the places where we should be making the hard conversations happen.
Media, by which I mean the public conversation, is a huge part of this problem. It's in turmoil, and nobody believes any of it. What's the opportunity in media to come at it with new ears?
It is actually literally relationships that will change this. It is simply finding that person who totally disagrees with you, but whom you're able to take seriously, and bringing them into your work. That's all. That's all it takes. If we all started doing that, it would all change. I believe it so strongly and find it so infrequently.
For example, how might it work? Right, left, or...
Let's just say you're a producer and your job is to think up show ideas. So you always have a set of people who are your advisors. So who's on that list? Now, who is somebody who really disagrees with everybody else on your list, but who, even though they disagree so mightily, you can grant that they're actually arguing in good faith. Add that person to the list.
Make an example of your experience with Curtis Yarvin, one of the intellectuals of the dark web. He's a monarchist, down with democracy. You made him a whole lot more famous by debating him at the Harvard Faculty Club. Would you take him on as a...
Exactly. Curtis Yarvin is a right-wing blogger who's a pro-monarchist. He's also pro-racial hierarchy. He's a eugenicist, etc. When I talk about bringing in people that one disagrees with, I don't actually mean somebody like Curtis Yarvin. Now, Curtis Yarvin, I certainly disagree with him, but also the other requirement I have is that a person meet standards of respect for facts, respect for truth, soundness of logical argumentation, avoidance of fallacies, avoidance of false premises, and so forth. None of that applies to him. His argumentation is highly sophistical when you read him. So the reason I'm saying that is because, yes, I was happy to engage in a debate with him. He's influential in the public sphere. I was happy to step into the public sphere and do a debate with Curtis Yarvin. I didn't invite him to one of my conferences or seminars, because when I invite people to my conferences and seminars, both things apply. I want somebody who I disagree with, and they have to be somebody who does respect the truth, respect sound argumentation, is arguing in good faith. And there are plenty of people out there of whom that's true, whose views are very conservative, very different from mine. So that's what I mean when I say that there is plenty of room to add to your list people that you disagree with, who one can grant are, in fact, practicing in good faith the work of argumentation.
Danielle Allen, speak of your own project, which you call renovation of democracy, where does it go from here? And what's the difference from organizing a political party or a particular lobby?
It's two things. It's reconnecting people to their civic experience, power, and responsibility, and also working to redesign our political institutions and political infrastructure so that it is actually responsible when people flex those civic muscles. That is, we want our institutions of representation to genuinely channel citizen voice. We want to see deliberations among our elected officials that reflect the whole swath of the population and then yield results that are efficiently implemented, right? Whether it's service delivery or whether we're talking about enforcement. So none of that really is happening very well in our democracy. Most people don't really feel like their voice is being channeled into our politics. We watch paralysis in our legislatures, whether nationally or at the state level. None of us think that we're right now particularly good at efficiently implementing outcomes of government choices and decisions.
All of it sounds radically true to me. What, if anything, does it have to do with Donald Trump's voice in our lives?
Honestly, it has very little to do with Donald Trump's voice in our lives, except for that the fact that our institutions don't work for us is a part of what makes us as a people vulnerable to demagogic politicians. So a renovated democracy is one where our legislatures are actually working for us. And we need our legislatures to work for us. We need that independence from the executive if we're going to have a free society. So that brings us back to that sort of question about freedom with which we started. So, we have all been watching paralysis for too long. I mean, Congress's approval rating in 2013 was 9%, right? So Congress obviously does not have a high approval rating now, but it's been more than a decade that we, the people, have approved of our own voice at that rate of 9%. So democracy renovation is about moving forward to a place where for the 21st century population that we are, our institutions are actually responsive to us and we feel connected to them and we know how to use them. So it's not just you and I, Chris, running for office because we happen to have that distinct family heritage and education that makes that conceivable.
Summer to spare, right?
Exactly, yeah. But there's a kind of broader field of people who understand that, they can take charge, they can take ownership. So it's all of that. And at the end of the day, our legislature, our national legislature is not functioning well on our behalf because it is primarily elected by very small slivers of the electorate, thanks to gerrymandering and low turnout in party primaries. So Congress is no longer meaningfully elected by the whole people. Somebody wins a primary with 8% of the electorate or 5% of the electorate, and then it's an uncontested general. So that means most of our members of Congress are currently beholden only to 5 or 8%, say, of the population in their district, right? That gives them very little actual room for making decisions, trying to do problem solving, because they always have to satisfy that base. It also makes them very vulnerable to a figure like Trump. It is easy for a figure like Trump to control that 8% of an electorate. If somebody actually depended on 50% of the electorate to hold their seat, they wouldn't be as vulnerable to an executive controlling their elections.
Tell me what getting rid of party primaries, something you've championed in a very original way, what does that have to do with it?
The way I see the world that we're in right now, we're like a bear in the forest. We're caught in a trap, okay? And at the same time that we're caught in a trap, we've got wolves attacking us. And at the same time that the wolves are attacking us, there's a wildfire that's raging on the edge of the forest, okay? Like that's the current moment we live in. So the wildfire is, a destabilized global economy impacted by technology, driving climate change, driving mass migration at unprecedented levels in world history, destabilizing, countries from an economic point of view and also producing anxiety around culture. That's the wildfire that's raging. And the wolves are the politicians who are attacking us right now. Whichever side you're on, the way you feel attacked in that kind of cultural revolution sense, those are the wolves, all right? And we're all focused on fighting off the wolves. Fair enough, right? But the trouble is we're in a trap and we'd be able to deal with the wolves a lot better if we could get out of the trap. And the trap that we're in is exactly this trap of our party system having captured our democracy and reduced the actual democracy elements in it. Sort of like squeezing out the connection of elected officials to the whole electorate. So that, again, if you are, running for office and you get through in the sort of the primary, at the end of the day, like that's who you work for, just that 8% of people. If you have no party primaries, if you have a single ballot with all candidates on the same ballot and then the top 2 vote getters going forward to a general election, then all candidates have to campaign to the whole electorate both moments, both for the primary moment and for the general. They'll learn to hear again. All the people that either party can't hear right now, they'll have to hear them again. And then when they're doing their work in office too, they'll actually have more degrees of freedom for problem solving. So as an example, there's 4 states that don't have party primaries. Okay, Louisiana, California, Washington, and Alaska. When Biden was trying to get his debt ceiling through, if you compare how Republicans voted on that, Republicans from those states without party primaries, 90% of them voted for the deal. State with party primaries, 60% voted for the deal. Why? Because they have to satisfy their partisan base. They're afraid of being primaried. So if you're not afraid of being primaried, if you are working for the whole electorate, you actually have more degrees of freedom in your decision-making as an elected official. So that's the trap we've got to get out of, that totally polarized politics that has frozen up and locked up our Congress and made it unable to actually have its own voice so that it's only subject to, really dependent on the president. All right? That was a very elaborate metaphor, I realize. But so springing the trap is about getting rid of party primaries. We can still have parties. This is actually good for parties because it puts them back in the business of competing for all the voters, puts them back in the business of listening to all the voters. They will get stronger. All right. So it's actually good for parties. People can still run for party labels. Parties can still hold conventions. They can endorse a candidate. It's just that they don't get to shrink the voter base every year, smaller and smaller number of voters that they actually need to hold office. It's crazy.
We're talking ranked choice.
No ranked choice involved. It's even better if you throw that in, but we don't even need to get there. We don't need to go to the perfect. We'll just do good. Okay. Better than status quo.
Immediately, I'm thinking Elon Musk saying, get rid of both parties and find something new that would get the unclaimed 80% of our fellow Americans. This vast, I won't call it middle,
right,
but
exactly. It's
unsatisfied.
Not necessarily middle, unsatisfied, vast unsatisfied population, yes. As my grandmother would call me, I'm a one-note Nelly. And so that's where I come back again to getting rid of party primaries. Because one of the things you get when you do that is you don't have to pick a ballot, R ballot or D ballot or green ballot or libertarian ballot. You just get the whole ballot. You get all the choices in one go. And that brings people back into participation. So it's sometimes not exactly that people are just they are unsatisfied, but what they're really unsatisfied by is the choice structure we currently give people. So young people here in Massachusetts, 18 to 25, 74% of them are in favor of getting rid of party primaries. And it makes sense when you stop and think about it because most of them aren't enrolled in a party. So they want to just have their whole choice set in any given election moment. And so, there may or may not be a need for a third party. We have terrible structures in this country for creating new parties. So it's literally one of the hardest things there is to do. But there is certainly a need to have people who aren't registered in parties have an easy pathway into participation, which they currently don't have. Because the good news is we've got 50 states. And so we can do a bunch of different things at the same time. That's the great thing about the country that we have. So recently, Minnesota and Maine, for example, have passed legislation to prohibit political expenditure by companies that have foreign ownership over a certain threshold. That takes 85% of corporate money out of politics.
Wow.
Most multinationals, right, are over the threshold. Most money being spent in politics is being spent by multinationals. So if it's supposed to be illegal for people who aren't either citizens or green card holders to spend money in American politics. There's a loophole to that role through corporate expenditure. So, for example, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund is a major owner of Uber. When Uber spends money on ballot initiatives here in Massachusetts, that's the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund spending money on ballot initiatives in Massachusetts. That's the kind of thing that you can get out of politics with this piece of legislation that has actually now passed in 2 states. So, the reason I say that is because go back to the bear in the woods, caught in the trap, fighting the wolves with the wildfire racing towards the bear. The bear, to get out of the trap, that really is about what's the package of reforms where state and federal meet. What are the things that states have control over that actually structure how our federal system works? Money in politics is one piece. How our elections operate is another piece. And any given state is going to have a different kind of actually feasible chance of doing any of these things. So we need every state to be figuring out what it can do to help us all slip the trap. So some states should get rid of party primaries, and some states should be working on the corporate money and politics thing, et cetera. We've all gotten so good at paying attention to the swing states in our politics. That's just the wolves, okay? That's just paying attention, like, is it the gray wolves or the black wolves that are going to win this year? I think we need a new map where we're paying attention to, like, what are the 8 states where if we could get these reforms through in these states, we slip the trap. We start having a Congress that can work for us again. So there's stuff we could do in 2 years. Every 2 years, how do we slip the trap? And when we slip the trap, we don't have to deal with the wolves anymore.
Danielle Allen, I'm so grateful for this conversation. You've changed my mind on a lot of questions, but you've sent me out in search of a whole new list of questions. And we barely mentioned Donald Trump. A triumph.
Well, that's a good thing. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.